Welcome in, everybody, to Betting Pros. It's time to place your bets. It is me, Joey P, Joe Pisapia, and this, of course, is the Saturday NFL Wildcard Preview Show, and we're always brought to you by BetMGM, the king of sportsbooks. Download that BetMGM app right now and get your wagering on. And today, to help me break down the Saturday games, Matthew Freedman, our own head of content, our man about town, always looking to make things better. And of course, one of my favorite people in the industry. You know him from his work at Number Fire and at FanDuel, Jim Sannes, everybody. You can follow him on the Twitter machine at Jim Sannes. And gentlemen, we've got a pretty good Saturday slate of football here. The wild card slate kicks off on Saturday afternoon. NFC West showdown between the second-seeded 49ers, 9.5-point favorites. That number's moved from 10 to 9.5. Against the Seattle Seahawks, the 7th seed. And then the later game, the night game, you're going to get the 4th seeded Jaguars, who are now 2.5-point underdogs at home, hosting the Chargers. First playoff game ever for Trevor Lawrence and for Justin Herbert. So exciting time, some fresh blood in the playoffs in the NFL. Before we get into these games and break them down, Jim, a little bit of line movement in both of these games in the last 24 hours. Before we dig into them individually, what does that tell you?
It tells me people are higher on Seattle than I thought they'd be. I kind of thought this is one that would hang steady at 10. It is back at 10 at FanDuel Sportsbook at least. It's minus 118 on that 10 though, so it's basically 9.5 there. It got to 9.5 very briefly, then snapped back to 10, which says to me it's probably going to stay where it is right now. I think the more interesting thing here is the money line. It was about 420 this morning, and now it's 385. So you're actually getting a bit of interest in Seattle, which I don't think is wrong. I think that this is a pretty decent number for them. I've got Seattle's win odds at 22.4%, so pretty in line with the market, a little bit above. So I actually think the move towards 385 is fair. So I think that's fair. As far as the Jags-Chargers game goes, I think it's hopefully the market getting things right, because I took the Jags money line when it was plus 104. So seeing it at minus 104 right now, I'm like, okay, tentative optimism is the way I want to say it.
I like that.
I think the Jags are really fun in this game. I think that game's going to be a blast regardless of whether I win my bet. So I feel pretty interested by the movement so far. And I think given that that's where my numbers are for both the Jags and the Seahawks, I think that is actually just confirmation bias. I don't know. It feels good to see some slight movement that direction.
Look, if there's anything we all love, it's a little confirmation bias.
Right.
Now and again, we're allowed to feel good about things. Freedman, some people might say that, well, half point here, there doesn't make a difference, but that's not the case, especially when you work with some of the models that I know you work with. So what are your thoughts here about this line movement in each of these games before we dive a little deeper into the money lines and into the numbers?
Yeah, especially at this point in the season, once we have 16, 17 games worth of data, a half point means much more than I think it does earlier in the year. But I think that these numbers are moving in the correct direction. I don't, for either of these games, have a big edge projected for really either team, but my numbers are leaning at this point a little bit more towards Seattle if the number is 9.5 or 10. And I have this very close to a pick 'em in the Chargers and Jags game. And so that number opened actually at 2.5 and very quickly moved to 1.5, and then now fluctuating between the 1.5 that we see in the market. So I think that line movement is correct, especially at this time of the year. I think line movement tends to be more accurate than not. And so I would say this is the market becoming increasingly efficient. And given that there are only 6 games this week instead of 16, people earlier in the week are just starting to really hone in on the games. And I think action that we would maybe see on a Thursday, we're starting to see on a Tuesday.
That's, I think, a very astute observation there. I agree. So what happens, we also tend to overanalyze when we have more time and less things to do, which is another trap. So hopefully we'll avoid that. All right, let's get into the 4:30 p.m. game Eastern time. Again, 1:30 on the West Coast. You got the Seattle Seahawks, who, pulled themselves up by the haunches after having kind of a nosedive in the last month of the season and kind of, righted the ship at the very end. They're going to visit the very hot San Francisco 49ers. So 7 meets 2 here to kick off Saturday afternoon. Now, the Niners have won 10 straight, including 5 in a row with rookie quarterback Brock Purdy. At some point, I always feel like in the playoffs, Brock Purdy is going to be called on to make a play. And that's when I want to really try to evaluate what Brock Purdy is going to be for the San Francisco team and whether or not that's going to lead them further into the playoffs. Now, We have the spread right now, which is 9.5 on the San Francisco side here, hosting Seattle, and we have 43.5 as the number. If you like Seattle for the upset and the money line, you're getting a really good number, plus 370 right now on Betting Pros. That's the consensus number. So, Jim, let's start with you here on this one. What's the value of this game here? What are you targeting in terms of the spread, in terms of the over/under? How do you see San Fran, Seattle?
Yeah, I think this is a game where you can see it being a couple different ways. You can see Seattle winning. I think that's very fair, given that it's the NFL. A lot of weird stuff can happen, and like Matthew was saying, like my numbers do say that there's a bit of value in Seattle in terms of potentially winning this game. I wouldn't want to take the points though, because you can see a lot of ways it spirals. And if I'm going to take on the potential for spiraling, I'd rather take the money line, take that more volatile market. It's a plus 385 at FanDuel. So I think that I'd rather just go that route, take the more volatile market rather than the spread, because you can envision it in your head. You can envision a Brock Purdy to George Kittle touchdown pass early on, and then Eli Mitchell, Christian McCaffrey grinding things out the entire rest of the way. And it can be a snowball effect. Seattle gets down. They just had a huge high emotion game this past weekend. They get down, they can't rally. So I don't want to deal with the points here personally. I think that if you like Seattle, I would go with the money line instead. Obviously, scale your bets to properly account for the fact that it's a low probability outcome. 22% win odds for me, you want to make sure you're accounting for that. So I think that if we're talking about the side, I'd rather go with the money line here and take Seattle there. I don't see any value in San Francisco minus 500. I think that if I am betting, it'd be the Seattle money line. As far as a total, it's at 42.5 at FanDuel. I think that's low. I've got this at 46.1 right now. There is some potential rain in this game out in Santa Clara, which is worth monitoring, but the winds are low. 7 miles per hour, that's not too bad. Nothing to worry about too much, and the rain doesn't appear to be overwhelming. And again, it kind of comes back to what I discussed. You can see the 49ers moving the ball pretty well in this game. And you could see a scenario where they are flirting with this over by themselves. So I think, to me, the two best bets in this game right now are Seattle money line and over 42.5. I think both those showing some value, and you don't have to tell yourself too crazy of a story to talk yourself, at least for me, into either of those.
And great point too, bringing up the return of Eli Mitchell last week. Also, his workload carving in a little bit to what CMC usually does, maybe a little fresher CMC for this round of the playoffs. That's certainly a good thing. And also somebody else that they can grind out clock if they do have a lead. That's huge, and not spend Christian McCaffrey too much if they are in a situation to advance. So you kind of like their potential going forward in these playoffs. Freedman, when you're looking at the board here, where do you see the value? Once again, just to recap, 9.5 is the number, 43.5 the over/under, and the Seattle money line plus 370 in the consensus.
Yeah, I have this projected at 9.25. And so it's not enough for me to want to bet on Seattle in this spot. And to Jim's point, if I'm going to be taking a position here on one of the teams, it probably would be the money line. But I think we're probably close enough to the market where I probably won't be doing that. And, with all 6 of these games this week, they are rematches. And, people talk about, especially divisional opponents, it's really hard to beat a team three games within a year. Like, maybe, but the fact is I don't know. I think this line is right. It's a market where the Seahawks against the spread, Pete Carroll going against Kyle Shanahan, their head-to-head record is 6-6. Divisional opponents tend to play tight. So I would think that this number feels probably close to correct, but given the chaos that we could see, Seattle would be the team I'd probably back on the money line, but I don't want any part of it. I think this is going to be a kind of nasty game. And in the projections for the total, I have it 44.6. So like Jim, I am leaning towards the over there. And, especially with this number, bumping down to 42.5 was 43. So 42.5, 43 across the market. I would be a little bit inclined to take the over. The thing is, like my lizard brain tends to look at trends, and I know, like at this point of the year, divisional games, those tend to play towards the under. And then especially even if you're not thinking of divisional opponents, but you're just thinking playoff football, a little more money in the market, people tend to bet the overs. Outdoor playoff games tend to hit the unders. And so I would just see in a vacuum how, okay, Seattle's defense, I think, is not that good. I can see how they allow a ton of points, but divisional matchup, outdoor game, the weather isn't horrible, but it's not an indoor game, and it's still a rookie quarterback in Brock Purdy making his first start. And so maybe that San Francisco offense isn't quite as efficient as it has been to this point. I'm probably just staying away. But I got to say, Brock Purdy, he has been incredibly impressive. And, to start with the Garoppolo injury, I significantly downgraded the 49ers from that spot. Because,
I did too, in all fairness. I had shares of the 49ers that I'd invested in as soon as Garoppolo took over. I think at like 6-1 to win the division or whatever it is, and then go on to, to the Super Bowl. And I was loving that investment. And then when Garoppolo got down, I jumped the gun for sure. I'm sure, like many people, went, okay, this is going to get ugly real sad. But you mentioned Brock Purdy's been impressive. Do you think now that he is up to the task, though, Freedman, of, let's say it is a tight game, let's say it is playing to the under, is he up to the task, in your opinion, from what you've seen, to make that play that makes a difference? Because that is the difference between regular season football, even against in-division opponents, and playoff football.
I'll just say I don't know. Like that's the simplest.
I don't think any of us know, and that's why I think you and Jim discussing the money line is so fascinating. Jim, you mentioned that as well. What you've seen out of Geno Smith, I'll turn the tables. Do you think Geno Smith, from what you've seen out of him all year, who has been called on that had no, Brock Purdy's expectations were low. Geno Smith's might have been close this year. Like they were pretty low, yet he has put himself in that conversation for comeback player of the year. He has put his team in the playoffs. Do you think Geno can make that spot? Because both of you guys have mentioned that money line number on Seattle, that if it's close, eventually it comes down to typically a quarterback making a play. Can Geno be that guy?
He kind of did it already in that Rams game. And I think that was like, that game was not a good game from Geno. He had that pretty bad pick right away. He didn't play well, but I think it was impressive that he stayed focused. And he still had confidence late in that game, because you'll a lot of times see these like really fun runs for guys where they'll go on like a tear. And like Geno had that at the beginning of the year, and then something goes wrong and it can kind of spiral, but he kind of locked back in and was able to rally them. Obviously the Rams are in their current state, a lesser defense than the 49ers. And that was a game that was in Seattle. Rams had effectively nothing to play for, whereas Geno had everything to play for. So it shouldn't have been that close of a game. But I think the fact that he was able to close it out still, use his legs of it, which we hadn't seen a ton so far this year. I think that was interesting. I think that that's something to keep in mind for prop betting for this week is you will often see quarterbacks run a lot more in the postseason than regular season because everything's on the line. And I think that could be intriguing for Geno, because I wouldn't be like, I think that if I were Seattle, I'd drop some, design quarterback runs for this game. Geno looked fast in that Rams game. So I think he can live up to the task. I think that it helps when he has guys like DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett. It's weird to talk about DK Metcalf as a veteran because we're all very old now. But like he's been around for a long time. Lockett's been around for a super long time. I think that's all super beneficial. Pete Carroll has tons of experience. So I think that I have faith in Geno as like a person, but also I think the infrastructure around him is good enough to give me some faith in them as well.
Great points there.
Some thoughts on Geno here, and and thinking about the comparison to Brock Purdy. Geno was like absolutely fantastic in the first half of the season, and weeks 1 through 10, 17 touchdowns, only 4 interceptions, over a 72% completion percentage, 8.3 adjusted yards per attempt since the bye. And it's not like just like that clean of a split. There have been other things to go into it. Tyler Lockett being injured, but we have not seen Geno Smith perform at nearly the same level. His completion percentage has dropped down to 66%, touchdown to interception ratio 13-7, 6.9 adjusted yards per attempt. Like he's been an above average, it's like slightly above average quarterback since the bye, but he hasn't been like the earth shaker that he was to start the year. And Brock Purdy, he has been absolutely amazing. Like, like Hall of Fame, like legendary type of like start of a career, right? 9.9 adjusted yards per attempt in his 5 starts. And so, Joe, you asked the question, like, could Brock Purdy do it if he's in that situation, like 2 minutes, drive his team down the field? I think a lot of what we have seen out of Brock Purdy to this point is a function of the Shanahan offense. And that's not to say that Purdy hasn't executed it nearly to perfection, because he has, but a lot of it has been within the structure of the offense, executing what he's been asked to do, and Shanahan going like deep in his bag of scheming guys open. And again, this doesn't mean that Brock Purdy isn't talented, because he was a great prospect for the NFL in the first 2 years of his career at Iowa State. It's just in years 3 and 4, he kind of stagnated. And so
it's also not a prolific throwing offense either, historically. They like run the football, play defense.
I feel like that's pretty representative of who he is. Like a guy who early in his college career showed that there's a lot of NFL potential there, but someone who didn't develop. And so maybe with Shanahan, he actually could develop into the guy that we saw early on at Iowa State. But where he is right now in his career, I don't think that he really has I'm not sold that he is the guy. With 2 minutes left, Shanahan can't scheme things open for him. It's just Purdy out there on the field needing to do it on his own. I'm not sold that Purdy can do it. That doesn't mean he can't, because what he has shown us up to this point has been amazing. It just means that he hasn't shown that he can do it at this point in the NFL.
Can I take a way of rephrasing that? It's not investable yet.
Yeah.
This is betting pros, right? So it's something that's really tough to invest in at this point. Whereas Geno has been in the league a little bit longer. I always feel like the teams with nothing to lose, like the Seahawks, have nothing. I mean, they were not supposed to be here. They were like Dante from Clerks. They were just not supposed to be here today. They were supposed to be at home, hanging out, playing hockey. And instead, now they're in the playoffs. And to me, those teams are always very dangerous. San Francisco has expectations. And I think Shanahan's got a little pressure too, because this is a team that has gotten to the mountaintop almost and fallen short a few years. So I feel like there's a little bit of pressure here. He gets a pass because he's on his third quarterback in a season. So he's going to get a pass regardless. But at the same time, there's no way, I think mentally, there isn't a little bit of pressure here on the San Francisco 49ers and on Shanahan as well. All right, let's move forward to the next game here, because I'm looking forward. This is the fresh blood of the NFL here. These are two young quarterbacks. Everybody's handsome, has long hair, something that the three of us on this show know very little about. And you're in a spot where I'm really looking forward to this. I'm a huge Trevor Lawrence fan. I always have been. And despite suffering a tough Week 18 loss to Denver, LA is in this. And I know people are pissed off at Staley for playing guys, but considering last year the way they took their foot off the gas and ended up missing the playoffs, I don't think there's anything wrong with trying to get the Chargers to get on track and play hard and have some momentum going in. Did it work out? No. Was it worth a try? I think so. But let's talk about the numbers, because that's what matters here. Both of these teams are going to be heading into the playoffs for the first time, quarterbacks again for Herbert and for our good pal on the program here, Trevor Lawrence. Jacksonville 9-8, Chargers 10-7. Right now, this number is sitting at 2.5. The Chargers are favored, which seems like just a huge trap to me, Jim. Just a huge, enormous, like it's like not even a good trap. It's like a trap that, you see it in like a bad Wile E. Coyote cartoon where he's dug this enormous hole and he's put this huge, carpet over it, and it's got a sign with birdseed right there in the middle of it. So let's start there. Let's start with the money line for this game too, which is you're getting Jacksonville to plus 110 on the consensus. As you said, that's moved as well. And you're getting 47 as the over under. Jim, what are your thoughts on this game between Jacksonville and the Chargers in Jacksonville?
Yes, we've seen this number move towards the Jags, and obviously you want to get the best number. You want to get in before that movement occurs. So you maybe listen to this and be like, I might have missed my boat, but I still think there's value in the Jags if we ignore where the market opened. Because if you ignore the fact that it opened at 2.5, opened with the money line being plus money, it's no longer there. If you just told me it opened at minus 104 in the Jags money line, I'd be like, let's go. Like, I think that's still a lot of value, because I have two separate models I use for betting, and the better one, the one that's worked out, has been more successful recently, has the Jags favored by 3.96 points, which is a lot. It is the biggest error I've seen in a playoff game in a long time. So it's I don't deviate from the market that much typically in playoff games, but here we are. So 3.96, the Jags are favored. So you're like, okay, that model's too high in the Jags. It weights up passing efficiency. It might penalize the Chargers for a lot of stuff. So we turn to the second model. What do you see there? Jags favored by 3.5. So in both models, the Jags are favored by more than a field goal. Does that make me uncomfortable? Yeah, obviously. They haven't been here since the Blake Bortles year, I don't think. So 2017, Oof. They were cooking the AFC Championship game, stuff like that. But I don't disagree, despite the fact it might feel really weird. I don't think it's totally wrong because this Chargers team is infuriating with how dependent they are on hero ball and late downs. They put Justin Herbert in awful situations and expect him to bail them out. And he does. He's awesome. But is that sustainable? We saw that in the Raiders game in week 18 last year where they were trying to rally for that tie. And Herbert, again, or time after time after time, gets them huge conversions and late downs and eventually gets it to overtime in that game. They shouldn't have been there. They should not have gotten there if they didn't have a freakazoid quarterback in Justin Herbert. But you can't put a guy in a hole that often purposely, it seems like, and expect him to dig you out every time. So I actually think it's okay to have the Jags favored here. They have been a productive passing offense for the entire season. They're facing a Chargers team that, Mike Williams sounds like he'll go, but, we don't know about Joey Bosa. There are some question marks on both sides of the Chargers team. If I assume both those guys are in right now, I show value in the Jags, which means if they get ruled out, there'd be even more value. So I think even though this is a move towards the Jags, you kind of miss the boat a bit. I still think there is value in the Jags in this game.
Joe, I gotta ask you a question here. I gotta ask the guest a question.
Oh yeah.
Jim, so in the models, and I don't want to dig too far into the weeds, but what kind of goes into your model? So I'm assuming that it's based on some of the historical data of what we've seen out of the Chargers to this point in the year. And so my question would be, if a lot of that data is no longer representative because, let's say, Mike Williams was out for a chunk of that time, Keenan Allen was out for a chunk of that time, they were missing some players on defense. So if it's based on data that isn't representative, I guess the question is it based on data that might not be representative?
It's tweaked. Basically it's I have the full season numbers here, and then I look at what their numbers were and their splits with the guys who are healthy.
Okay.
So with both, it's a small sample, which means you're not taking that sample at face value. You're looking at what the numbers say and the gains they've had, Joey Bosa, and then adjusting okay, is this representative of what you should expect? Because for some teams, they will be worse when their star players are active, which is not logical. So you're still going to bump them up. For those guys, you just kind of use it as a guiding light to decide which direction to go. Now, with the Chargers, I have their passing offense as being a step below what I'd expect with Keenan Allen and Mike Williams, because Mike Williams is not fully healthy. Even if he plays, he's banged up. So they are tweaked from their baseline to account for that, because they've been playing without Mike Williams for long stretches, without Keenan Allen. But then the defensive side, having Bosa back does definitely help them. So those are factored in. It is a manual adjustment, which means I could be underweighting those guys, but it is factored in there.
Well, with all the adjustments being made, I think one adjustment we all have to also keep in mind is, let's talk about the adjustment that the Jacksonville Jaguars defense has made lately. They have allowed just 22 points combined in the last 3 games. Now, I know we can talk about some of the quarterback play, perhaps they were going against. That's fair, but they're also getting to the quarterback quite a bit, regardless of who that quarterback is. They have at least 2 sacks in every game since week 13, and in 2 games, 3, and in 2 games, 4. They are getting to the quarterback. You put pressure on the quarterback, good things happen. You could tell because you're also seeing interception numbers here along those lines when you look at the defensive numbers for the Jacksonville Jaguars. As much as we're all talking about the quarterbacks and talking about the offenses, and that's what probably the national media wants to focus on, me being the nerd for defense that I am, I kind of want to talk about the Jacksonville Jaguars defense and what they can do in this game to stop Austin Eckler, but also put pressure on Justin Herbert and try to force some mistakes here, Freedman. That is the angle I keep coming up to whenever I'm talking about this game. We're all wrapped up in the quarterbacks. They're fun, they're exciting, they're young, they're the future of the NFL, but defense wins championships. And the Jacksonville Jaguars defense has been pretty good lately. What are your thoughts on this game? Where do you see the value?
The Jags defense, it's inconsistent. It's volatile. So wide range of outcomes with them, and I think it's hard to predict game to game, matchup to matchup, what version of the Jags defense is going to show up. Because sometimes you would think, like they have a really good matchup in this spot, and then they don't do what it is you think that they would do given the talent that they have. But they are an emerging defense.
Yes.
They do have talent, especially on the defensive line. And going against an offensive line in the Chargers that is also inconsistent, you could see some pressure there. The thing with Herbert is that he has become very good, especially this season, at compensating for the deficiencies of his offensive line. He does not take many sacks, and that's not because his offensive line is good. It's just because he has been able to get rid of the ball pretty quickly. And that does speak, I think, a little bit to the some of the inefficiencies of the offense for the Chargers in terms of why it is that they're not pushing the ball down the field a little bit more on early downs. But at least Herbert hasn't been taking a lot of sacks, and they are in situations where they're able to extend drives. One thing I'll just say, I do have this close to a pick 'em, but I have the Chargers as slight favorites. But there are some things that do point towards the Jags, and these are like small edges, but they do kind of add up a little bit. So one thing that is in the Jags' favor, this is a primetime game, and we do have their coach, Doug Peterson, has historically been good in primetime spots. We don't have that for the Chargers. Another thing, the Chargers traveling across the country. And so like that time zone difference is another thing with a team traveling west to east. And then one more thing, you do have a slight rest advantage, a 1 day rest advantage for the Jags, in that they played last Saturday, whereas the Chargers played on Sunday. And so they're, playing with only 6 days of rest. So there are these small edges that I do account for in my model. And like any one of them isn't that big of a thing, but like the three of them together, and it's like, yeah, this puts it pretty close to a pick 'em, but I still have the Chargers as the slightest of favorites. I think the over might be a spot that is slightly intriguing to me. I haven't bet on this game or the other game. I haven't taken a position yet, but the total right now is, I believe, 47.5. And I have this projected at 48.5. So I do think that there is some value there. But not enough to make me want to jump on it at this point. I kind of want to see a little bit where the numbers go.
One other thing, obviously, we talked about the quarterbacks in the last game. Let's talk about the coaches in this one too, because Jim, you've got a coach in Doug Peterson who has taken a team to the Super Bowl and to a victory over a Patriots team coached by Bill Belichick. Preparation is important. I think it's always tough for, young coaches to, learn on the fly. Sometimes we see magical things happen at sports, but at the same time, experience does matter, and preparation for understanding what these teams have to do in this spot matters too. Is that an advantage in your opinion? It's not going to show up on the stat sheet necessarily, but is that an advantage of the Jacksonville Jaguars people should consider when making investments in this game?
Yeah, I don't consider it too much. I think the bigger thing I'm considering is like, which Brandon Staley do we see? Like, do we see the 2022 Brandon Staley who's been kind of a coward in terms of like aggressiveness? Or do we see the 2021 guy who was like freewheeling, like, hey, I've got a superstar quarterback, let's use him? I don't know. I don't think he knows which version we'll see either, because it seems like he got bullied.
Did we see that version because of all the wide receiver injuries, because we didn't have Keenan Allen, and because we didn't have Mike Williams for so much of the season? Was it just maybe just pulling in the reins because let's just focus on trying to, because of what you don't have, not so much what you do.
Maybe. I would hope so, because I want to see, I'd rather watch Justin Herbert than a punt. So like, I'd rather see a more aggressive version, but like, I can't guarantee that we'll see a more aggressive version of Brandon Staley. So I think that's kind of more what I'm interested in, is because that could relate to the total as well. If they're going to be aggressive, go for touchdowns versus field goals, that not only changes, like, could push you towards the over, but also changes like key numbers and the way you want to bet this game in that regard as well. So I don't know. I think the bigger factor for me is whether Brandon Staley continues to be a coward, or if we see like the last year version of him. Again, if we assume that everyone's fully healthy, and I can't assume Mike Williams is fully healthy. I can assume he'll play, but I can't assume he's fully healthy. And I think that's kind of the reason I'm hesitant to be super jazzed about the Chargers in this game.
All right. Any final thoughts here, Freedman? I can tell your mind is always going here on the program. You're looking at things. Final thoughts here on the Jags game before we close out today's show.
Yeah, there was one more small edge for the Jags that I missed, and that the Chargers are playing their second straight road game. And so, like, if you took away all of those little edges that I mentioned, then my number would be exactly where the market is right now at like 1 or 1.5. But because of those edges, I do have the slightest lean towards the Jags, who I have projected at 0.25 underdogs.
All right, for more, you can always go to bettingpros.com and check out our prop bet cheat sheet too, as the props start coming in for these games. All of it right there in front of you, what the biggest variance is, where to bet it. I mean, we're doing the work for you, so go check it out at bettingpros.com. Go check out Jim Sanis too. It's incredible work. Jim, you're the top of the board, baby. You're the 1-1. I always love talking football with you, man. So grateful for your time. You follow him on the Twitter machine at Jim Sanis. Check out his work at Numberfire and at FanDuel. And of course, you can follow him on Twitter there. That'll do it for us. But the story of the game goes on. For Jim and Matthew Freedman, I'm Joey P. We'll see you next time, kids.